Senator DeMint.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for beginning a process of hearings. I appreciate the panelists in their testimony today. The fact is that most of the testimony today dealt with navigation issues and things that affect the Navy on the waters around the world. That's about 10 pages of the treaty, and certainly we need to deal with this. There are a lot of theoretical advantages, I think, that have been discussed. As has been mentioned, I think, by the General, the United States plays by the rules, and the idea that we get into a rules-based system with other nations that establish some international rules of engagement, theoretically, I think we could have some honest debate on how we come out on that. It doesn't always come out okay. I know we brought China into the WTO because we thought if we could get them in a rules-based system, then we would have a fairer system. It hadn't worked out that way, and only a few months ago, a lot of us here on the panel were squealing about China manipulating their currency and not playing by the rules. We know when we try to deal with the UN on sanctions against Iran, not all of the members play by the rules. They're not always that effective. And of course, we have a history of arms treaty when we go back and find that the other players are not playing by the rules. So we could have a reasonable debate that there is a possibility that when we enter into agreements as a nation with other nations that don't play by the rules, we could put ourselves at a disadvantage. But we could talk about that later. The concern I have is almost 300 other pages of the treaty that has really not been dealt with much today. And just for a few clarifications, we don't have a veto in the Assembly of this convention. We can have a veto in the Council, just as Sudan has, one of the world's leading sponsors of terror, but we cannot have a veto in what the Assembly decides as a whole. And also, the oil companies don't pay the royalties. The United States does. The treaty specifically says that the state members pay that, and the taxpayer will ultimately pay it. I just want to make a few points, ask a short question. Of course, 160 other nations want us in this thing. We need to think that through. Because, as has been said, maybe we have a lot to gain, but we will pay more than any other nation that is part of this agreement because of the royalties that have been discussed. Of course, they want us in this. They also get to help define the rules of engagement for the U.S. Navy all over the world. And that may be theoretically a good idea. But there's been a lot of testimony that the international rules of engagement on the ground for our troops in Afghanistan have put our folks in harm's way. So we do need to debate that. And we do know from the treaty that it very clearly subjects our states, our electric utilities, our businesses to environmental lawsuits that will be arbitrated by panels that could be slanted against us. Because it's very clear from the treaty, if we have a dispute with another nation, we appoint 2 arbitrators, they appoint 2 arbitrators, and the Secretary General of the United States appoints the 5th. Those aren't odds I want to deal with when it comes to doing business in America. And I would just ask, and we've talked about this already, and I'll maybe direct it to the General, because I certainly respect his advocacy for what he feels like is important to the Navy. But this treaty is much bigger than that, involves a lot of other things. And given the fact that American oil companies have already leased a lot of land, 200 miles out in the Gulf, to begin development of that. And we've done that without the law of the treaty. And we can keep the straits open, and we have committed to do that whether we're in this treaty or not. But General, how is it in the interest of the United States to turn the royalties over to an unaccountable international bureaucracy? And I know Senator Inhofe asked this, but given the fact that we're facing billions of dollars in shortfalls and cuts in our military, and this is something that is real money that is going to be paid to an international body at a time our country is almost hopelessly in debt, and it will be distributed to countries that may be our enemies, like Sudan. Again, I respect your advocacy for the naval aspect of this, the navigation aspect. But what we're trying to deal with is the whole treaty and what it might do as far as cost to the American taxpayer, cost to American business, and just our ability to operate freely around the world. And I know that's a loaded question, but maybe you have an opinion you'd like to swing back at.
Well, what I would like to say, sir, is that the economics of it, I will leave to the economic experts. But from the security perspective, I would want to have a further conversation about where in the treaty you see our rules of engagement or our activities limited, because they're not limited in any way. And by the way, sir, we never cede the rules of engagements on the ground, to include in Afghanistan, to any other nation on the face of the earth or any international organization.
Well, I appreciate that answer, because on one hand, I think we're arguing that, hey, we need this for our military to operate freely around the world in a rules-based system. And then I hear the treaty allows us on a military or defense front to completely opt out of this thing anytime we want. So why do we need to give in to all of this in order to be able to operate our Navy as we have for years around the world?
Well, I'll take a shot at it and maybe pass it off to either of the secretaries. But right now, our freedoms of navigation, right now the description of maritime zones and the freedoms of navigation, or the rights of navigation, are codified in international customary law. I'm not comfortable with that any longer, because of the reasons that I gave to Senator Shaheen on the way that the security in the maritime domain is being challenged by some of the rising powers, by the opening of the Arctic and other areas around the world where that customary international law is now being subjected to individuals' interpretation. And so I think it is in our benefit to become part of that conversation.
Well, General, just as a follow-up, some of those countries that are interpreting the law are already parties to the law of the sea treaty. They're not following the rules, or at least they're arbitrarily interpreting them. What's going to be different that we're in it? Are they going to now abide by the rules the way we see them? My concern is we will abide, but they're already violating the rules that they've ascribed to. And I don't know how this creates a system of rules that we can count on.
Go ahead, sir.
Senator, I think the question you have to ask yourself is whether or not acceding to this convention gives us the best of both worlds. It gives us the ability to protect our military activities, gives us the ability to conduct what we have to do in terms of our ability to operate in the seas. It gives us the ability to avoid any kind of dispute resolution with regards to military activities. So it does give us the ability to opt out of that which we don't want to participate in. But at the same time, it gives us the ability to engage when we have to engage. I mean, better to have a seat at the table than not at the table when they're dealing with issues that affect our claims, that affect our economy, that affect our rights. That's the key here.
Mr. Secretary, is there any table in the world that we're not sitting at right now?
Well, yes, we're not sitting in the seat that's reserved for us, and the seabed mining table. And to be clear, Senator, any assembly decision, because you referenced that, has to go through the council. We have a permanent seat on the council. Other members rotate. But I really want to do everything I can, and I know my colleagues feel the same way, to try to explain over the next months in the process that Chairman Kerry has started why we do think, as Secretary Panetta said, this is in our interests, and it is, for us, the best of all worlds. Because otherwise, we will put our economic interests and our economic players in a disadvantageous, uncompetitive position. And I think what you're hearing from both General Dempsey and Secretary Panetta is that when we are now facing new threats that largely arise out of the incredible race for natural resources that will be primarily based in the oceans, we need to be able to play any card at our disposal, and we think we will have more cards if we're a member than if we're not a member.
Thank you. Thanks to you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And I'd just point out to the Senator, we'll go into this further, but the veto, here you are correct, is not within the Assembly, but there's a restriction specifically defined within the treaty as to what it could go to the Assembly, and the royalties are specifically reserved to the Council to send, and that has to be by consensus. And consensus is specifically defined as requiring a formal, any formal objection. So, the veto.
Well, I'd like to get into that because it begs two questions. First of all, Sudan is on the council. If we have a veto, they have a veto. Their interest is very different than ours. Is there a question about whether they're on the council or not?
They are a member, they've acceded to the convention.
Mm-hmm. And they're on the council, the
Well,
International
there, a lot of member states, and 160 of them are technically within an all-member body, but all the important decisions are made by the council, and there is absolutely nothing in this convention which says that.
I'm speaking to the council. I'm looking at the list of members right now, and Sudan is on it. And so if we have a veto, they have a veto. And so it's just something we need to look into. Again, the devil's in the details. We've talked about some theoretical advantages that might address some navigation issues, but that only assumes if other countries are playing by the rules. There's very little indication within the treaty convention of the members already that that's happening, or that we can count on it in the international community as we go forward. But again, I want to thank all